Oh yeah. Here we go now. That's it right there. Oh, yeah. That's right. Oh, feel that. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Confessions of a Domestic Engineer. Okay, folks, been kind of really harping on negative stuff where I can't really offer much in the way of answers or solutions or how to fix it. So let's do something light and a little more fluffy. Let's talk about the music industry and how it all went to hell. All right, first off, I am going to start by completely, totally, and utterly blaming the USA for destroying the music industry. 100%, completely, totally, and utterly. England isn't much better, but that's not quite the same situation. Why do I blame the USA for destroying the music industry? Okay, so singles were huge. Where, if you could be a band that could get a single on the radio, you could potentially get yourself set up to start moving, start getting a life. You want examples of this? Look at the Beatles, look at Jimi Hendrix. There are other bands out there. They all started with, even Alice Cooper, under the name of the Spiders and the Nazz. The Rolling Stones, I believe. Where I'm going with this is they all started off by cutting and releasing singles as opposed to releasing albums. Even when those particular artists started releasing albums, they still did something different with the singles than they did with the albums. I've talked about this a lot in album reviews and stuff like that. Now, the killing of singles really in the US really started to hurt the industry. There are a lot of artists and musicians out there, especially when you get into the 80s, you get into the 90s, and then definitely after the 90s, where they should not have been releasing whole albums. Money should not have been wasted on the production of whole albums. Singles and EPs were all that should have been released, all that was honestly needed. And especially when you get into the 90s, multi-disc CD players were very common. So there is no, the girl I dated throughout most of high school, she had a portable CD player / desk or dresser unit. It's technically a little too big to be used as a regular portable, but it had a handle and it could use batteries, so it counts as a portable. And it could do 3 discs at a time. So you could go out, buy singles, go load 3 singles up, and usually a single will have at least 2 songs on it. Sometimes you'll get 3 depending on the length of the song on the single. So the US market should have still been releasing singles. Bands, groups, etc. like Aqua, for example, with Barbie Girl. What else did they really release outside of that song? Should have been a single. Backstreet Boys. If you own a Backstreet Boys or an NSYNC album, half the album were singles, half the album was complete filler and garbage. This even applies to rock bands too. I hate to say it, but there was a lot of stuff that Ozzy released throughout the 90s that should have just been released as EPs or singles instead. Full albums weren't needed. I'm trying to think of some other ones here. A lot of the pop ones is really where it goes to. When you get into a lot of pop artists, if they had been releasing singles instead of everything else they released, they could have done a lot better, and they could have saved the music industry. The problem was in the mid to late 70s, or mid to late 60s, everybody wanted to release albums. And that's what they did, is everybody wanted the big 45, get 45 minutes worth of music on your record, etc., 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 instead of potentially turning into one-hit wonders. The downside to this is this didn't allow the opportunity to develop artists. Like, there are some artists, like when you look at the Doors came out swinging with an album. I don't think they did the slow build-up with singles. I believe they came firing right out of the gate with an album right off the bat. But when they released an album with a variety, a multitude of tracks on there that were solid tracks. Many of them could be singles, but it was recorded to be an actual album. But because of that, these bands didn't get time or the Doors really didn't get time to develop, which is, I think, one of the reasons that led to the Doors imploding. Bands that got proper time to develop and grow and build up a following, like Alice Cooper is one of the best examples I can think of. Or Kiss. Alice Cooper, Kiss, Rush is another one. Bands that were given... No, Rush is not a great example. Alice Cooper, Kiss are better examples. Even Kiss isn't a great example in this case, because Kiss came firing out of the gates with albums as well, instead of singles. But these bands were allowed a chance to build up, to get a following. Like when Alice Cooper finally got signed, I believe he got signed for, it might have just been the first album, the Love It to Death. This is post Frank Zappa, when he got signed like on a major label. The Love It to Death album, I believe, was a 1-album contract, but that then led to a 4-album contract after that. The first one with the single of 18 did well enough that it did exceptionally well, that the studio said, okay, let's go out there and do that. Plus you had Alice Cooper with his live performances on top of that, adding to it, which really made a difference as well. But Alice was allowed to grow and develop. That was the whole thing with Alice. Alice was constantly growing and developing. David Bowie, the same thing. If David Bowie, and this is going into my next part aside from the singles, is the growth and development. Record labels really wanted bands to explode coming out of the gate. Like when you think of all the big bands you know of in the 90s, okay? Like let's look at just the grunge bands, okay? If you look at Nirvana, Pearl Jam, not Soundgarden, this does not apply to Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. The reason it doesn't apply to Soundgarden is Soundgarden had actually been around for a while and had released a couple albums before they had busted out. Nirvana technically busted out with the Nevermind album, but Bleach was right before that. Bleach did get them some notoriety. I believe Soundgarden had like 3 or 4 albums before they busted out with Bad Motorfinger. I think Bad Motorfinger was the one. Anyways, where I'm trying to go with this is Nirvana got way too big, way too fast. They didn't have time to grow. They imploded because of it. Kurt Cobain, on top of a multitude of other problems that caused them to implode. Pearl Jam, while still technically being out there, Pearl Jam is still out there, but Pearl Jam kind of always stayed against the establishment, which is kind of cool on their behalf, but their album sales kind of really tanked after they kind of went more against the grain and stayed more alternative-like, especially going and fighting against Ticketmaster, one of the few bands that really was willing to fight against Ticketmaster. And it hurt them because of it. Ticketmaster, I'll get back into because that's a whole different problem on its own too. Oh my god, for hurting the music industry. Alice in Chains, another one. They imploded because they weren't allowed to grow and develop. The Beatles did not come flying out of the gate releasing their greatest album ever. Depending on what you define as their greatest album, that took quite a few albums to get there. My Alice Cooper, I will argue that either Love It to Death or Killer is his greatest. I usually keep them tied at the same position as his greatest album. But let me tell you, anybody that says they prefer any other album more afterwards, I'm not going to argue with, depending on what album they pick. You know, like anybody that says Welcome to My Nightmare is their favorite album, I'm not going to disagree with that. Welcome to My Nightmare was an amazing album. The growth and the production and everything else like that, from when you look at Love It to Death to there, is amazing. Absolutely amazing. And that was only over like a 4-year time period, you know, and multitudes of albums. Rush is another band that thankfully was given time to grow. Imagine if Rush was given basically 3 albums. You got the original album, Caress of Steel, and then 2112. Well, actually, Fly By Night, I think, and then 2112. And when you look at that, the first 2 did not do great. So what do they do when it comes time to do the next album? They just go as overboard as they can with it. You know, like, by the time, I think the Fly By Night album was kind of okay enough to buy them enough time to do one more album. And they did 2112, and totally off the rails, never should have been a success, but because they were allowed the time to grow and the time to build up and whatnot, by the time 2112 dropped, it was gangbusters, man. People were just clamoring for it. They were dying for it. They wanted this stuff because they had the time to grow. That never would have happened in the 90s. Rush never would have been given that chance to grow. If that first album did as bad, I mean, not to say that it did bad, but it definitely didn't do good. If that album had done the same sales in the 90s that it did in the 70s, there would be no Rush. You know, look at Metallica. Metallica is a great example. The only reason Metallica exists the way they do is because when they released the first album, Kill 'Em All, they released 100,000 copies, and they moved those 100,000 copies because they worked their asses off to get out there to get the exposure and whatnot. It helps that they were in California, so selling 100,000 albums within California is not overly complicated or difficult to do when you look at the population. But that gave them time to grow, and, you know, they get signed by Elektra and whatnot after that. But Ride the Lightning didn't blow them up. They didn't become this huge band with Ride the Lightning. Master of Puppets is arguably where they finally started getting some attention, you know, opening for Ozzy and whatnot. And then tragedy strikes and whatnot. But they still didn't break open yet. They released Garage Inc., Garage Days, the original Garage Days, which does decent, keeps the fans appeased. Then they release And Justice for All. And they finally get their first hit single, which is technically the music video for One. One still was not regularly played on the radio at that point. Not at all. Very rarely. Like, I mean, if you were actually at a place that played metal stations, sure. But you needed Much Music in Canada or MTV in the US to really get the benefit of One. And you're talking, this is now 4 full albums and an EP in. Well, 5 albums, I guess, and an EP in. And then you hit... Wait, hold on. I can't count today. It's 4 albums and an EP, okay. Then you hit the Black Album. 5th album, folks, okay? So you got all these albums before it with arguably their best material ever written. And then you hit the Black Album. Finally, 5 albums later, they strike gold. Bands aren't given that opportunity anymore. No one is willing to invest that time into them. You know, I mean, arguably, Megadeth technically hit gold before Metallica did with Peace Sells. when it comes to popularity of, or how soon they got a hit single or whatnot. So it really says a lot about how the industry works and whatnot. Guns N' Roses, another example. They exploded out the gate with their first album, and then they imploded. They didn't have time to build. And I think it's that, coming full around to that second part there, that is that allowing bands to get a following, to do something. That is what created and established great bands. Not these bands that came flying out of the gate with amazing, album full of hit singles off the first album, Led Zeppelin 1, decent album, don't get me wrong, but it's Zeppelin 2 where they really started to make a name for themselves. Alice Cooper, Love It to Death was the first major label. He had 2 with Zappa prior to that and singles prior to that, so he had time to build. There was some building there. Black Sabbath. The Black Sabbath album is amazing, but let's be honest, man, it took Paranoid to bust that band out wide and open. And even then, it's still, they had to keep going and pushing. Another thing that I know I've mentioned before in the past, and I'm going to bring up here, that really killed and destroyed the market was going into a large market instead of small markets. Like, you had the Midwest, the Southwest, the West Coast, the East Coast, the Northwest, stuff like you had areas, so bands could build in those areas, and then if they got really good, they'd move out of those areas. And then you go into world level, okay? What I mean by this is, Alice Cooper's always the greatest example for me to use here. But you could use this with Kiss as well, just starting in a different place. Or other bands. Rush. Okay, so interestingly, Alice Cooper and Rush both actually would have similar stomping grounds in some cases, which would be Toronto, but at different times. Alice Cooper started in California, okay? The California scene did not understand, did not get the original band. So they traveled around the country looking for a place that actually understood them, actually got them, stumbling on and landing in Michigan. Detroit specifically. Detroit and Michigan got them. The Midwest got them. And they built up in that market, and then when they got huge in that market enough to move into other markets, they started going out and moving into other markets again. And traveling around again, because they had a name for themselves to make it worthwhile. The Doors, primarily for the longest time, played in California, almost exclusively, like the Sunset Strip area. For the longest time. And then eventually, as they built up a name for themselves and they got popular, they moved out into other territories. Kiss started out as a New York band, built themselves up in the New York area, and then moved into other territories. They technically, actually, I believe, moved up into the Midwest because they were doing better in the Midwest. Even when you moving along outside of that, California was definitely a huge place for breaking bands, okay? Detroit was huge in the 60s for breaking bands. New York's always kind of been weird for breaking bands. Like, you do definitely get a lot of bands that have come out of New York, but they usually don't break in New York. Kiss really didn't break in New York. Like I said, they broke more towards Detroit, Michigan, the Midwest area. Dee Snider, Twisted Sister, same thing. They didn't break in New York. They broke technically more in Jersey. Anthrax. Did Anthrax ever really break? But the reason why I mentioned Anthrax is one of the big four of the thrash metal bands. And of the big four, they're the only one that did not come out of the California area. Because Megadeth, Metallica, and can't remember the one with the S. Slayer. All broke in the California area. Then they moved out from there. Anthrax, on the other hand, I guess I'm going to assume broke in New York area. Beastie Boys, they did break in the New York area. They broke huge in the New York area, and then they moved out of the New York area. And Windsor, actually, where I'm from, used to be a huge market for that as well. Windsor literally made Alice Cooper. Windsor could make and break artists. Not anymore. Windsor died. Windsor died a very long time ago from artists. I unfortunately have to say that when it comes to Windsor music, one of the biggest problems with Windsor is the music scene really sucks. Which is going to bring me around, actually, to my next point with band breaking and stuff like that.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing okay. I'll need a stick to walk.
There are no venues anymore.
Good.
When I grew up in the city of Windsor,
What a little
in the 80s, we had
Trust a man who walks the streets in his pajamas.
2 to 3 large venues, and by large meaning you could
I think
do,
it was. You know, I just didn't think.
I don't know, let's say anywhere between 200 and 500 people in the venue, book a half decent sized band in there, and do some decent
Take
money.
your time, Ernest. Look after
This
yourself.
was definitely something that was possible in the 80s, 90s, but by the time the 2000s hit, forget it. Windsor still has 2 bars that can host some decent low-level bands. The venues can still hold, like I said, 200 to 500 people and whatnot. We've got a couple theaters that can be used for bands and musicians. The problem with the theaters, though, is they're in horrible areas with no parking. Absolutely no parking whatsoever, because these theaters were built in the days before everybody had cars. And over the multiple decades, no one's adapted and thought, hey, let's build a parking lot here. With all the buildings we ripped down, let's build a parking lot. And even the small level bars, most of them aren't interested in supporting up and coming artists either. In the 90s, I personally, being in a couple bands that were trying to be up and coming, we had a choice of basically 3 different venues to play at. There was one bar that I played at a few times, I can't even remember the name of now. It was some type of lounge. And I really... Champions? Was it Champions? No, it wasn't Champions. Champions is gone too. Anyways, the bar was decent, but the bar didn't do anything to promote the bands. They expected the bands to do all the work to get everybody in. They wouldn't bother to put bands up on the marquee out front, anything like that. So basically, they were okay as a starting band bar, but if you were a starting band and you could not get any other bands with you and you're trying to bring in your own crowd, it was really complicated. That's how you get those situations where you're playing to you and your 3 friends in the crowd, and that's it. But at least the bar existed to be able to do that. The downside is you made absolutely no money off of it, and it was horrible. You put way more money into it than you'd get out of it. And that's a whole different issue. Then there was another one called Milk, where the owner was notoriously bad for underpaying the bands. He would not provide receipts for how much was made during the night, would tell the bands they'd get 10% of the bar, and then claimed that the bar basically made 10, 20 bucks all night, even though the bar was packed. And this happened enough that people would not book themselves into it. They would only go through promoters, and even promoters got to the point where they stopped booking there because trying to get money out of a venue that was getting packed was becoming too difficult. Now, Windsor still has 2 bars that still exist that can do small bands. One is called Villains, and I've been there a couple times. The bar is not a bad place to go. I hate downtown bars. And the other one is also downtown, and it's called Fog. And Fog, I've got mixed history with Fog. I've had many issues. I know they've gotten better about it over the years, but in the past I had huge issues with their attitude towards the majority of bands in the city. They refused to book hard rock heavy metal bands, completely refused to book hard rock heavy metal bands for the longest time. They do it now because those are the bands that have been around the longest and have the best followings. But for the longest time, they absolutely refused to do it, came up with every excuse under the sun not to do it, and would only support musicians that, and are independent, alternative kind of musicians do need support. But when that's all that you're supporting, and then when people start complaining that, there's not enough diversity, they get upset. There was a lot of issues back in the day. I don't know what it's like now, but back in the day, there were a lot of issues with Fog. And most musicians I know actually would not play there. I knew about 20 to 30 musicians that had played there 2 or 3 times and said they would never step foot back in the place again, because Fog had a real bad habit of, especially with local bands, they would not pay the band flat out. They would want the band to charge door, but then they would also expect that all their regulars would be allowed to go in for free. So you'd have like 10 to 15 people in there drinking, filling up the bar, listening and enjoying all this music, but not paying and contributing to these bands at all in the slightest. It became a really big, huge issue. And there were some noteworthy names in the city that flat out refused to play there because of that type of practice and behavior back in the day. Once again, this is going back to the 90s specifically, early 2000s. I'm sure things have changed over the last 20 years. But there's no middle range. Like, you got 2 that you can get some low-level big-name bands in for. You've got a bunch of ones that are good for starter bands, but they're not housing starter bands. They're housing established bands and established musicians. There is nowhere for high school kids to get into to play bands, play music, get a career going that way. For example, going back in the day, Windsor actually had a pretty decent underground punk movement for a while back in the early to mid 90s. So we're talking like 92 through, no, not 92. We'll go 93 through 96, 97. And there were some bands that made some very good noise and names for themselves in the city. There was Wonka Vision, the Radioactive Schoolgirls. Before that, they were Pixie's Wish, and then Pixie's Wish still existed for a while the Radioactive Schoolgirls were going. I'm trying to think of some of the... I can't remember the names of some of the other ones. I was just actually kind of close with the guys in the bands from those 2 bands. Or those 3 bands, I guess. And in the case of those bands, there were small venues that would let them play, let them get established. Basement kind of punk-like venues, what you would want and whatnot. And that's what you wanted, that's what you needed back in those days. And those venues all started disappearing because people were complaining about the noise. And then it just kind of escalated. So all these places for all these little guys to start out, all these high school guys to start out, they disappeared. And that meant, okay, so that there's nowhere really for bands to go practice to get as much as a band can practice, unless you get time on a stage, actually getting out there and get comfortable on a stage, it doesn't matter how much you practice at home. It is not the same thing as when you actually get up on the stage. And if bands aren't getting that exposure early on, they're not going to build what they need to be able to move forward and do better as it goes on. I mean, as someone who's been in multiple bands in my last band, same thing. We, some days, could sound like we were gang fire just screwing around practicing at home. And then the next day go play the show, literally play everything we just did, and because one particular member of the band had stage fright issues or confidence issues and wasn't getting enough stage time, didn't get enough stage time early on, kept kind of freezing up on stage, and that could cause problems, and did cause problems. So that's another major contributing factor to why the music industry is so crap, you know? So you've got the fact that singles and the way that albums were done are garbage. You've got lack of venues that is a real issue. Not allowing bands to grow and build up following, expecting huge followings right out the gate. Then from there we move on to radio itself, which also goes kind of back to the markets. When there were individual markets, what you might hear on the radio coming out of California would be different than what you'd hear coming out of the radio in Detroit, would be different than what you'd hear coming out of the radio in Chicago, would be different than what you're hearing coming out of the radio in Atlanta, etc., 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 okay? And also, as I mentioned really early on, Detroit's really kind of unique because Detroit, you could find Motown, you could find rock, you could find punk, you could find heavy metal, you could find glam, you could find, like, through the 60s, going into the 70s, you could find everything there, okay? Detroit had it all, which was really cool that way, really diverse. That's not the case with everywhere else, you know? Which would allow more of an explosion that way for certain bands too. But then radio kind of became this giant homogenized crap in the late 80s, early 90s. This big radio act was passed. And basically you went from a bunch of tiny independent radio stations to, you know, I think like 5 companies owning 90% of the radio stations. And they were all playing the same things. It was easier to have one, you know, to use satellite and whatnot, or, you know, signal boosters or stuff like that, and just do programming from one central office in New York for the whole entire country, or one central office in LA for the entire country, than it was to have all these individual DJs and whatnot going on. Detroit, I believe, still has 1 or 2 independent stations where they can get away with stuff and it's not all mass produced stuff. But even with that, the song selection or the playlists are still pretty basic, you know? When they play a Led Zeppelin song, you're going to get one of about 5 options. There'll be Stairway to Heaven or Kashmir if the DJ needs a pee break. Communication Breakdown, Immigrant Song, Rock and Roll, or Black Dog. That's kind of, you know, like, those are kind of the go-to standard. There are some other ones in there as well, but those are kind of like the 5 go-tos there. Alice Cooper, you get like 18, School's Out, No More Mr. Nice Guy. You might get Poison. Maybe 1 or 2 other ones. That's kind of, you know, that's kind of the extent of it. Detroit's a little different. Detroit will play some extra ones in there, but not a whole lot of different. AC/DC, same thing, you know. You get the same 3 or 4 songs all the time. And this is with a lot of the bands now. The classic bands that have these ample catalogs. And part of that is, you know, they're trying to hit mass appeal to keep people listening, but they don't care about playing songs the way they used to. The other thing that's really weird with that, and I have issues with, is the way that and this is a major other contributing factor with radio in particular, is the way that artists get paid out with radio play and programming. I do not know if this was always the case, but each time a song gets played, an artist gets a certain amount of money for that song being played on the radio. And it can change from song to song with specific artists. So, for example, and these are not exact quotes, these are not even quotes, okay? This is me just giving examples, okay? We're using Led Zeppelin, as I already mentioned. Stairway to Heaven might cost 12 cents for the radio station to play. I don't think it's actually 12 cents, but it might cost the radio station 12 cents to play Stairway to Heaven. At the same time, if they wanted to play, say, something a little more obscure, like say they put on When the Levee Breaks. When the Levee Breaks actually might cost them 20 or 30 cents to play instead. Alice Cooper, for example, let's even go with that. It might cost, and I went with longer songs there, so going with shorter songs. Under My Wheels used to get a lot of Detroit play. Might cost 5 cents. Exact same album. Another big song, Desperado, which also used to get some radio play in Detroit. And not to be confused with the Eagles version. Desperado might cost 20 cents to play instead. It's really weird, it's really stupid how this is designed. I also actually have issues with the fact that the artists are getting paid for radio play. Because that radio play is actually, you're basically paying that artist to make them more popular. I have huge issues with that. It kind of goes against being able to discover new music. Like, it really hurts pushing new albums even. You know, because going back, we'll use Alice Cooper again. You go back, you use Under My Wheels, which I said, what, like 5 cents? And then you look at the brand new album, The Road, and you pick any song off The Road, it could cost more to play that and give it exposure than playing a song that is for 50 years old. And that is not good for the business, because all you're going to do is influence the stations to play that instead, where they will make even more money, because God forbid 15 cents. And yes, those nickels and dimes are counted by the radio station that way. It used to be that you, as a band, you wanted your song on the radio, because if you got your song on the radio, that means you could sell it in the stores, you could tour on it better, you could get more exposure. Now, it's you want your song on the radio just so you can get that little tiny piece of change out of that, regardless of what happens with it. And this is why you've got, this is part of the reason why you always hear the same songs over and over again as well. There is a lot more I can go into on this, and I probably will on another episode, but this one's run really long. If you've made it this far already, thank you very much. Drop comments below. Let me know what you think. I'm going to probably continue this rant in the next episode as well. I don't know. I might give it a break, go back to something else, and then come back to this one. Either way, folks, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video for Grand Theft Auto. Hope you have heard some of the stuff about this, and I am going to do the next episode, because I believe in the beginning I did say something about offering some solutions, so I'm going to offer solutions in the next episode, which you should have already picked up what some of the solutions are here, but we'll get into it later. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button, subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications. TWA link below, check that out. That is the Trampoline Wrestling Association. Absolutely love it. A link to my Patreon. Peace, love, take care.